I used to think wingsuit flying was all about control, but hundreds of feet above the ground, that control can be gone in seconds. Hey, it's Patrick, and today I'm covering wingsuit deaths. From a pilot pushed off course into the wrong landing to two flyers colliding midair at full speed, and what went wrong in the seconds after. It was September 2014 in the Selkirk Mountains, British Columbia. The range sits deep in the interior of the province, a landscape of heavily forested ridgelines and narrow drainage systems that cut into the lower terrain without much warning. That afternoon, it was partly cloudy, around 44 degrees, with moderate visibility and no precipitation. Nothing in the conditions would have given an experienced backcountry pilot reason to reconsider, which is something I think about when I read through how the day started versus how it ended. Saurin Brewwell was 38 and worked professionally as a wilderness guide in the same region where he jumped. He wasn't an outsider to remote terrain. He understood it from the ground up. He had 520 total jumps and a consistent history of backcountry aircraft deployments over isolated mountain corridors. On every backcountry jump, he carried a handheld radio and a personal locator beacon, personal protocol he had set for himself, not requirements anyone imposed on him. He had thought through the risks and built systems around them. The plan was a solo aircraft exit at 12,500 feet over a mountain corridor, targeting a known meadow clearing for landing. A ground crew of 2 was stationed at the meadow with an expected landing window between 1:45 and 2 in the afternoon. The nearest road access was 14 miles out, a number that doesn't feel significant until you need it to be otherwise. The morning weather forecast had not flagged any significant low elevation wind along the planned descent corridor. That finding comes up again later in the report, and I think it deserves more weight than it was given at the time. Saurin exited the aircraft on schedule and flew a clean northwest line toward the meadow. He deployed at approximately 4,500 feet, a standard altitude for a planned accuracy landing over remote terrain with no alternate landing zones. His canopy opened fully, confirmed by altimeter data recovered post-incident. Up to that point, everything had gone as planned. At approximately 2,500 feet, an unforecasted crosswind of around 22 miles per hour pushed him steadily east. Under canopy, a pilot can steer toward a target but cannot fully overcome a sustained crosswind of that speed. By the time he was low enough to read the terrain clearly, he was already committed to a descent path approximately 0.9 miles east of the landing zone. What was below him was not open meadow. It was a steep gorge drainage with near vertical rock walls, loose scree slopes, and a shallow creek bed at the base. He came down inside it. Evidence at the scene, broken branches along the upper gorge lip, and a 6-foot drag mark in the creek bed gravel indicated a hard, partially controlled landing. That physical evidence is consistent with someone who got their feet down, but hit with far more force than a clean landing produces. The injuries sustained in those few seconds would determine everything that followed. His ground crew made radio contact at 2:18 p.m., 33 minutes past the landing window. Saurin confirmed he was east of the target zone, described his surroundings as best he could, and reported he could not move. Transmissions continued intermittently over the next 3 hours and 14 minutes. The regularity of those transmissions, spaced out, deliberate, makes me think he understood exactly what his situation was and was managing it as long as he was able to. A helicopter insertion was ruled out within the first hour. No viable landing zone existed within 2 miles of the gorge. The only viable foot route required descending from the North Ridge, a 4.5-hour approach under the terrain conditions present that day. The ground crew began moving immediately after the helicopter option was closed. Saurin activated his personal locator beacon at some point during the wait. The activation was logged by a regional coordination center at 3:44 p.m. That timestamp is the kind of detail that doesn't read like a data point. It reads like a timeline you can't reverse. He was still alive at 3:44 p.m., still making deliberate decisions. The ground crew reached his position at 6:52 p.m., Saurin was unresponsive and had been deceased for an estimated 40 to 60 minutes. Cause of death was internal hemorrhaging from blunt abdominal trauma sustained on landing. The injuries were consistent with a high-impact hard landing and were not survivable without surgical intervention, which, given his location and the access constraints, was never a realistic possibility from the moment he touched down in that gorge. The canopy was found snagged on a rock ledge about 28 feet above the creek bed. His chest harness had been manually released, consistent with an attempt to reposition after landing. The radio log showed 11 transmissions over 3 hours, and the personal locator beacon was recovered still active. Post-incident analysis confirmed a low elevation crosswind that hadn't appeared in the forecast. It was noted in the report without further conclusion, a reminder that the one variable that mattered most was the one no one had accounted for. No findings of negligence were made. The case was closed within the year. Saurin had every preparation in place, and none of it could close the distance between where he landed and where help was. What followed in my research was a different kind of ending. No waiting, no window, and a camera that documented every second of it. It was July 2017 in the Wasatch Range, Utah. The ridgeline that morning was dry and fully exposed, granite faces catching direct sun from the east, with visibility stretching for miles in every direction. By late morning, the temperature had climbed to 78 degrees, with no cloud cover and no wind worth measuring at launch elevation. Everything about the conditions was cooperative, and I think that's part of what makes this one difficult to read through without getting ahead of yourself. There was nothing to point at beforehand. No weather, no gear concerns, nothing. Ash Temlin was 27 and had come to sport skydiving through a path that wasn't typical. He had served as a military freefall parachutist before his discharge in late 2013, which gave him a foundation in canopy handling and freefall body awareness that most civilian skydivers spend years building from scratch. That background accelerated his progression into the sport, and by mid-2016, he had accumulated 260 total jumps and 52 in a wingsuit. He had been flying proximity specifically for 8 months, most of it over open terrain and gentle slopes rather than technical cliff faces. That distinction is worth flagging early because it becomes the center of the official findings. 3 crew members were positioned at a viewing platform approximately 580 feet below the planned flight line along the eastern granite face. 2 of them had flown the same line previously and advised Ash before the jump to maintain at least 15 feet of clearance from the wall throughout the run. He acknowledged the guidance. His GoPro was mounted on his helmet, chest altimeter confirmed functional before launch. From where the crew was standing, they had a clean sightline to the entire planned route. Ash launched from the ridgeline exit point and entered flight southeast along the granite face. For the first 7 seconds, he held approximately 18 feet of clearance, within the advised margin and consistent with controlled flight. Between seconds 8 and 11, a gradual left drift began quietly reducing that distance. Nothing about it registered as sudden. By second 11, clearance had dropped to under 9 feet. I've seen this pattern before in proximity incidents involving pilots still developing their instinct for reading wall distance at speed, small drifts that don't feel urgent until they already are, compounding through subtle body position shifts over several seconds rather than a single obvious input error. At the 13-second mark, Ash reached for the deployment handle. By that point, clearance to the wall had likely reduced to under 3 feet. The canopy never initiated. Impact with the granite face occurred at an estimated 128 miles per hour. All 3 crew members on the platform below witnessed it. The GoPro housing was recovered, cracked, but the memory card was intact, and investigators had retrievable footage the same afternoon before the full site documentation was complete. That footage became the primary document of the case. It confirmed active consciousness throughout the run, captured the deployment attempt at the 13-second mark and showed the wall filling the frame in the final 2 seconds with no canopy emergence at any point. Most incident files reconstruct what happened. This one simply showed it, and I don't think there's a clean way to describe how that changes the experience of going through a case file. The chest altimeter was recovered separately, and its data cross-referenced with the GoPro timestamp and terrain mapping to establish position at impact. That placed Ash at approximately 310 feet above the valley floor when he struck the wall, an altitude at which even a clean, unobstructed deployment would have produced a canopy with almost no vertical distance remaining to generate meaningful deceleration. I think about that whenever the deployment attempt comes up in the footage. He reached for it. The altitude had already made it academic before his hand got there. Cause of death was blunt force trauma, unsurvivable at point of contact. A technical rope team descended from the ridgeline above and recovered the body 2 hours and 40 minutes after impact. Each of the 3 crew members was interviewed separately in the days that followed. All 3 confirmed independently that no canopy deployment was observed at any point during the run, and their accounts aligned with the footage without exception. The official findings concluded the planned line exceeded Ash's proximity experience. It wasn't his total jumps or military background. It was that most of his proximity flights were over open terrain, where small errors are more forgiving. A technical cliff face removed that margin, and his progression into more demanding lines outpaced his cliff-specific experience. I wonder how that reads to someone who only sees the total number, because on paper, 260 jumps and a military freefall background looks like a solid foundation. The report makes clear it wasn't the right kind for that specific line. The investigation concluded without any findings of fault assigned to any individual. The file was closed on the footage, the altimeter data, and the experience log, and nothing in any of those 3 sources pointed anywhere other than the line itself. 13 seconds from launch to impact, and the footage confirmed everything in between. The next one I found had no camera and no cliff, just a seam, a warning that never left a filing cabinet, and a witness who stayed quiet. It was August 2015 in Moab, Utah. The desert was flat and open in every direction, and by mid-morning, the temperature had already climbed past 90 degrees with no cloud cover and no wind. Visibility was unrestricted. Conditions, by every standard measure, were ideal. Ren Calvert was 31 and had been skydiving for just under 4 years. 340 jumps sounds like a meaningful number until you understand how it was distributed. The overwhelming majority of his experience was in canopy piloting, precise, technical, deployment-focused. What he had almost no background in was wingsuit flying. 38 flights. I want to be careful not to frame that as recklessness, because 38 is a real number, but it isn't the kind of foundation you build advanced decisions on. Ren was attending a 3-day wingsuit camp, an informal gathering organized around group and solo jumps. The other participants were experienced, several with hundreds of wingsuit flights. I mention this not to assign blame to anyone around him, but because it shapes the specific decision that ended his life. Throughout the first 2 days, Ren watched the more experienced pilots deploying low, not recklessly low by their standards, but low relative to what someone at his level should have been attempting. Safe low deployments in a wingsuit require an immediate read on any malfunction and a fast transition to reserve, all within a window that is far tighter than standard freefall because of the forward speed a wingsuit carries. Ren's canopy background gave him familiarity with the deployment sequence, and I think that familiarity made the gap between his experience and theirs feel smaller than it actually was. Nobody at the camp established where his personal floor should be. I don't know whether that was an oversight or an assumption. Either way, it wasn't corrected before the 3rd day. On the morning of August 14th, Ren geared up for a solo jump. A fellow camper, someone he had been jumping with throughout the 3 days, watched him gear up and later told investigators he had considered saying something about the pull altitude, but didn't. That detail appears once in the witness statements and isn't elaborated on. I've thought about it more than most things in this file. His target deployment altitude was approximately 2,500 feet, consistent with what he had observed others using, and well below the 4,500 feet generally recommended for pilots at his experience level. His gear, by every post-incident inspection, had no defects. He exited the aircraft at 13,000 feet, flew a stable southwest, heading for approximately 110 seconds, and reached back to deploy at around 2,500 feet. What happened next took less than 4 seconds to become unsurvivable. The pilot chute cleared the container and inflated, but the bridle, the cord connecting it to the deployment bag, caught on the right forearm seam of the suit. It is a documented failure mode. The seam sits under tension during flight and can trap the bridle if it crosses at a certain angle on deployment. The bridle wrapped and held, the bag partially extracted but could not travel clear. The canopy streamed, exposed to airflow, but without the inflation needed to generate meaningful drag. The fellow camper who had watched him gear up was standing near the landing area when it happened. He was one of the witnesses who reported seeing no canopy at any point during the descent. I don't know what that's like to carry, and the report doesn't say. At the point the malfunction was confirmed, Ren was at approximately 2,100 feet. In standard freefall, that is a narrow but workable window. In a wingsuit, with forward speed still present and the full sequence required to abandon the main and deploy a reserve, that window compresses severely. Post-incident analysis indicated there was likely not enough altitude to complete the sequence even under ideal conditions. Not that he didn't try, but that the math may have already been against him before he understood what was happening. The reserve handle was found untouched. Ground impact occurred in open scrubland, approximately 2.6 miles from the drop zone. Jump staff located Ren within 25 minutes. The main canopy had been extracted but remained entangled and never inflated. The pilot chute and bridle were recovered, tangled around the right forearm of the suit. Cause of death was blunt force trauma consistent with undecelerated ground impact. During the post-incident gear review, investigators contacted the manufacturer regarding the forearm seam. What came back was not what anyone in that review expected. The record showed the configuration had been linked to bridle snag incidents on at least 2 prior occasions, and an internal notice flagging the seam as a known risk had been drafted and circulated within the company approximately 3 weeks before August 14th. It had not been sent to distributors. It had not reached any suit owner in the field. The information existed, it was documented, and it simply didn't travel. Whether that rises to negligence was noted in the report and left without a finding. The combination of a documented equipment risk that never reached the people it needed to reach, a deployment altitude well below what his experience warranted, and a witness who considered speaking up and didn't, that is what the case closed on. Ren's case closed without a single clear answer, and I think that's what makes it stick the way it does. The next case took me to Lauterbrunnen, where 2 experienced pilots flew a line they both knew, and neither one came out of the valley. It was June 2016 in Lauterbrunnen Valley, Switzerland. The valley cuts deep and narrow through the Bernese Alps, with granite walls rising over 1,000 feet on either side, and a flat green floor running along its base. That afternoon, it was overcast, around 58 degrees, with intermittent cloud shadow moving across the flight corridor. Visibility was adequate. Nothing in the conditions flagged as a concern, and I don't think either pilot would have hesitated if you'd asked them that morning whether it was a good day to fly. Callum was 34, a proximity wingsuit pilot from the UK with 8 years of valley flying behind him and just over 400 logged flights. He was, by any reasonable measure, experienced. Petter Vanes was 29, Norwegian, with 3 years in proximity flying and 180 logged flights. A meaningful number, though considerably less than Callum's. I mention the gap not to suggest Petter was unqualified, because he wasn't, but it matters for understanding the dynamic between them and the assumption that quietly underpinned the whole jump. The 2 had flown together twice before, neither time through this specific corridor. They had each flown the line separately the day prior, scouted it, understood where the rock protrusions sat, knew where the walls narrowed. What they hadn't done was conduct a joint briefing for the synchronized run. No agreed signals for course corrections, no defined abort protocol. I've read enough of these cases to know that experienced pilots often skip that step on familiar lines because familiarity builds a kind of confidence that is genuinely hard to argue with until something breaks against it. The plan was straightforward. Callum would exit the cliff launch first. Petter would follow exactly 2 seconds behind. Standard proximity spacing for a two-man synchronized run. Both had flown similar formations before in different locations, and neither had reason to treat the timing as anything other than routine. Callum launched at approximately 1:40 in the afternoon. Petter followed 2 seconds later. Both were flying at close to 125 miles per hour, carving southeast through the corridor with roughly 60 feet of lateral clearance from the eastern wall. 7 seconds into the run, Callum encountered wind buffeting near a section of rock that jutted slightly into the flight line. It wasn't severe, more of a brief instability that required correction. He rolled approximately 12 degrees to the left and moved off the original line. The adjustment took under a second. From his position, it was likely a non-event. I think about that a lot, how routine that correction must have felt to him in the moment. At 125 miles per hour, 2 seconds of spacing translates to roughly 370 feet of following distance. That sounds workable. It isn't once a lateral deviation is introduced without warning. By the time Petter reached the point of Callum's correction, Callum was no longer where Petter expected him to be. There was no visual warning, no radio call, and no time to process the change before the gap closed. Petter's left shoulder and helmet struck Callum's right leg and lower wing panel at approximately 280 feet above the valley floor. I want to be precise about that altitude because it's the detail that removes any possibility of recovery. At 280 feet, traveling at that speed, neither pilot had the altitude to deploy, even if they had been physically capable of doing so in the seconds that followed. Callum lost controlled flight immediately and struck the eastern valley wall roughly 1.5 seconds after the collision. Petter's suit was critically compromised at point of contact. He entered an uncontrolled rotation and hit the valley floor under 2 seconds later. 3 hikers on a trail above the valley floor witnessed both impacts. Lauterbrunnen draws significant foot traffic, and I don't think that detail should be moved past quickly. This happened in front of people who had no preparation for what they were about to see. Ground teams reached the valley floor within the hour. Both pilots were recovered approximately 340 feet apart. Neither canopy had deployed. Callum's cause of death was blunt force trauma to the skull and chest from the valley wall. Petter's cause of death was unsurvivable ground contact at near full glide speed. The medical findings on both were unambiguous. A GoPro recovered from Callum's helmet was reviewed by investigators and provided the clearest account of what had happened. The footage confirmed the deviation, the angle of correction, and the moment of contact. It was, from an investigative standpoint, unusually complete documentation for an incident of this kind. I didn't expect the footage to be as definitive as it was. No mechanical failures were identified on either suit. No gear deficiencies. Nothing that pointed anywhere other than the uncommunicated correction and the following distance that couldn't absorb it. The post-incident review flagged the absence of a pre-jump briefing as the primary procedural gap. Not the experience levels, not the spacing, not the conditions. The finding was that a single agreed signal for course deviation may have changed what happened in that corridor. I've thought about how small that fix would have been. One sentence in a conversation that never took place. No criminal proceedings were initiated. The case was formally closed within several months.